Okay, so it's till now. Let's get started. So hello everyone, welcome to at Seminar Series. I'm John, Seminar Coordinator, and I will be moderating the seminar with Kathy, our Communication Manager. This is the second of our seminars this year and the first virtual ones. So just some housekeeping. We will have the Q&A after the presentation, and we encourage you to bring up any questions you may have. You can simply unmute yourself and bring up the questions. Or if you don't have a mic, you can chat us your questions. And the seminar is being recorded, and we will post the recording on our YouTube channel. Before we get started, I'm going to hand the ball over to our director, Peter. Peter, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, John, and welcome to Anna Trugman, who has agreed to speak with us today. Anna is a professor in geography at UC Santa Barbara. By way of background, she got a degree in geology from Stanford, followed on by a PhD from Princeton. And she spent a couple of years with the University of Utah before landing at UC Santa Barbara, where she's been since 2019. So today we're going to hear about the biosphere, and Anna's going to talk to us about how forests receive the impact of climate change and what else is going on in the environment around them in terms of biodiversity and pest and how they react to things like droughts. And like many things in earth science, the solutions to the problems that we are facing probably isn't as simple as many people would like it to be, in terms of just planting a bunch of trees and trying to mitigate climate change that way. But I won't take up any more of your time. Let's have Anna talk about it because she's an expert in this. So we look forward to what you have to tell us, Anna. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lars, and thank you, John, as well, for coordinating everything. It's a real pleasure to be here, everyone. And so today I'm going to talk to you about plant physiology, forest ecology, and carbon cycle uncertainty in a changing climate. And please, if there's some issue with the slideshow, make sure to interrupt me and let me know. But before I get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge my funding sources and just highlight my lab group members, past and present. All of the work that I'm going to show you here today is really the product of all of the creativity and hard effort of folks in my lab. And so I'm incredibly privileged and excited to highlight what they've been up to with you today. I'm going to start off with some motivation behind a lot of the components of my research program. Forests are this incredible resource. So they host the vast majority of this planet's biodiversity. They also modulate surface energy fluxes, the hydrological cycle, and the terrestrial carbon cycle. And I'm actually really interested particularly in their role in the terrestrial carbon cycle. And the reason that I'm so interested is that they're this really critical carbon sink. So this is a picture of the global carbon cycle over time, where we have on the x-axis 1850 up to the present, and CO2 fluxes on the y-axis. And so the positive part of these axes represent the net emissions, so due to fossil fuel burning and land use change. And then these carbon emissions can go into three main pools in the Earth system over the short term. They can go into the ocean. And if you look, the amount of carbon going into the ocean is increasing in step with our emissions, but it doesn't actually vary a lot on short time scales. This carbon can also go into the atmosphere. And this is what I think of when I think of anthropogenic climate change, is rapidly rising atmospheric CO2. But if you actually look at the amount going into the atmosphere year to year, it can be highly variable. And the underlying cause of this is terrestrial ecosystems, plants. So terrestrial ecosystems currently sequester about 25 to 30% of anthropogenic emissions, the vast majority of which is in forest ecosystems. But over the historical climate record over the last several years, you can see that there's some years where they're barely, the net carbon sequestration potential is close to zero. A lot of this has to do with where water is across the globe. So these ecosystems are very sensitive to variations in climate. And looking forward under future climate change, it gets even more complicated thinking about how this piece of the carbon cycle will change because there are multiple competing mechanisms. So on the one hand, as we continue to burn fossil fuels and increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there's actually a physiological effect of CO2 on plant productivity and carbon use. And this is generally thought to be a positive effect in terms of ecosystem carbon sequestration potential. So as you increase CO2, plants actually rely on diffusion to get carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into their leaves through their stomates to perform photosynthesis and fix that carbon into sugars. And so as that concentration gradient increases, you can potentially increase the rate of photosynthesis. And actually, plants also end up losing less water in obtaining this carbon. So this increases their what's called water use efficiency and potentially makes them more resilient to drier events in the future. But in addition to this physiological effect associated with CO2, there's also a clear radiative effect, which from a plant perspective can have strong negative impacts on plant productivity and carbon sequestration potential. So with higher CO2, you warm the atmosphere. This can increase the amount of moisture the atmosphere holds and increases what's called the vapor pressure deficit, which can induce stomatal closure and prevent plants from assimilating carbon. It can also induce enough hydraulic stress that you can get mortality over the long term. And so you get both declines in photosynthesis, which decreases carbon pull down from terrestrial ecosystems, and potential accelerated carbon turnover if hydraulic stress is extreme enough. And what's really important is some of our process-based modeling tools that enable us to understand how this dynamic piece of the terrestrial carbon cycle is going to evolve in the future. Have thought a lot more about carbon assimilation processes and not as much about processes driving carbon turnover, like some major mortality events, such as this major drought event in California that occurred between 2012 and 2016. And these types of mortality events are really important from a carbon cycle perspective because they can release a large amount of carbon back into the atmosphere within a relatively short time period and cause a positive feedback on climate change. And this isn't a California-specific phenomena. So this is a map of major drought and heat-induced mortality events occurring over the globe over the past 5 decades, where the color legend or the color bar shows the year during which the mortality event occurred. And what's really important to keep in mind is each one of these points represents a major mortality event that can release a large amount of carbon into the atmosphere and cause a positive feedback on climate change. So really anticipating where and when we expect to see accelerated mortality associated with climate change versus increased carbon assimilation and carbon drawdown is of critical importance when we're thinking about strategies for getting to net zero. And so my research program uses a number of different approaches, including ecological monitoring, ecological theory development that ultimately goes into improving our process-based modeling tools, as well as applications-driven ecological research. And I'm going to highlight vignettes from each component of my research program today, particularly focused on student and postdoc projects that we're working on. And so the 3 vignettes I'm going to talk about today first focus on how important allocation is from a plant perspective in mediating stress and ecosystem drought impacts. Then I'm going to transition and talk about where and when does physiological variation matter for capturing the biogeochemical consequences of ecosystem drought responses. And I'm going to wrap up by talking about to what extent do disturbance and climate stress introduce uncertainty into terrestrial carbon cycle predictions. But first, I'm going to ask this audience maybe to stretch their expertise a little and think at the organismal scale when we're considering how important allocation is in mediating stress and ecosystem drought impacts. And this actually begins with some really interesting observations performed by Jordi Martinez-Vilalta in Scots pine trees across a climate gradient in Spain, measured in 2009. And Jordi measured this quantity AL to AS, or a plant's leaf area or water demanding surface, relative to its supply pipe for that water, AS, or its sapwood. And what was really noticeable is that he found that within a species, this allocation to the water demanding surface relative to the supply pipe was really variable depending on aridity. And when there was less water, plants would allocate fewer leaves to reduce water demand. My colleague Leander Andrade did a similar study focused on Australian species, so a number of eucalyptus and acacia species. And in this figure there, each species is shown in a different color. And found the same pattern where in drier locations, you have lower leaf area to sapwood area within the same species. So there's clear evidence that these plants are adjusting their allocation with water availability. And process-based modeling tools, I think, are really useful for testing hypotheses to try and explain the underlying mechanisms that are driving some observational variation. In this case, we're seeing this decrease in leaf area relative to sapwood area. And so I wanted to use this process-based model basically to see if there was some sort of adaptive adjustment going on with water availability. And this modeling tool has a realistic representation of plant gas exchange, a detailed representation of plant hydraulic processes. And in the model, plant photosynthesis or carbon assimilation and stress is an emergent property of the physiological parameters and the input climate forcing. And so it enables us to basically predict how environmental conditions impact plant hydraulic function and carbon gain, and helps us diagnose some mechanisms driving possible patterns in this case, allocation, when we're thinking about plant processes. And so we actually use this carbon maximization framework rooted in hydraulic theory, basically postulating to see are plants allocating to maximize their carbon assimilation to explain this variation in leaf area to sapwood area along a aridity gradient. And that's what's shown here, where we have these different acacia and eucalyptus species shown in color, our model predictions shown in black. And the model actually was able to capture this clamp down in leaf area to sapwood area, in this case along a vapor pressure deficit or aridity gradient, with this carbon maximization hypothesis. Okay, so I talked about some organismal scale patterns in allocation with aridity. Now I'm going to step up in biological scale of organization and think about how ecosystems respond to changes in water availability. And this is some work that's in press performed by a project scientist in my lab, Dr. Gregory Queaton, where Greg looked at the droughtiest years in the MODIS record since year 2000 using MODIS leaf area index across the continental US, and looked at what the leaf area index anomalies were in those locations during drought periods. And this is the result of that analysis, where we have Browner values correspond to locations where you get a decrease in ecosystem leaf area during dry periods. And you can see this map has a lot of brown on it, but there are notable locations where you get a positive leaf area index or green anomalies during drought events, particularly in locations where water isn't as much of a limiting resource, like the northeastern US, which is much more mesic, or the Pacific Northwest. And Greg actually used this same modeling tool and framework to try and diagnose the directional change we would expect leaf area to change if the main driver of those leaf area dynamics was water limitation. And so we use this same plant hydraulic modeling tool and this carbon maximization framework rooted in hydraulics. And this figure shows the agreement between the model predicted deviation in leaf area during those drought events relative to the observed MODIS LAI anomaly. And here, purpler values correspond with the model and observations agreeing in the LAI anomaly. Browner values correspond to the model and observations disagreeing. And we can see there are a number of locations, particularly across the Western United States, where the model and the observations agree, but there are clear locations where the model's failing, like the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast, highlighting some really nice, I guess, locations where the model hypotheses are sufficient to explain ecosystem dynamics, such as water-limited systems, and those locations where something like nutrients or light limitation might be stronger regulators of these leaf area index anomalies rather than just drought events. And so finally, another former postdoc in my lab, Dr. Justin Mathias, used this same modeling tool to explain vegetation structural transitions at dry range edges. So he used observed canopy height diagnosed from LIDAR and compared it to the model predicted carbon use efficiency. And he was basically able to find where across the globe we expect trees versus transitions to shrublands through these sharp declines in model predicted carbon use efficiency, which corresponded to vegetation state changes at dry range edges that were documented in the LIDAR and also picked up using this model carbon use efficiency. So with these validation tests, we actually decided that this model was a really useful platform to think about where adjustments within a species to allocation to leaves, and this is an example of such an adjustment for a blue oak tree in California, which is an endemic species to California. And on the left, we have a tree in the range core near the Bay Area, and the right, there's a blue oak tree right near me here in Santa Barbara that's at the dry range edge of blue oak extent. And you can see these clear differences in canopy allocation. So where differences in allocation might mediate range transitions versus where you might need some sort of species turnover in forest tree types to buffer changes in climate versus state changes in vegetation type, such as transitions from forest ecosystems to shrublands. And so to run this set of experiments, Greg was using to parameterize this continental scale model experiment, forest inventory derived maps of species composition linked to plant physiology, which is these different physiological components that are really key for parameterizing our plant hydraulic model. And so this is an example of one of the physiological traits included in the model, a trait called P50, or the pressure at which 50% conductivity is lost. And this is a metric of how tolerant different tree species are to water stress. And here, less negative values correspond to species that are more drought vulnerable. More negative values correspond to species that are more drought resistant. If you're familiar with the climate of the continental US, this map makes a lot of sense, where we have the much more mesic eastern United States, where you have species that are not as used to water limitation, having much less negative P50s. And if we look in the western United States, we get purpler values, and this is where you get both overall lower water availability and also periods of drier periods throughout the year and wetter periods throughout the year. So discontinuity in water availability throughout the year. And what's really nice about this forest inventory data is that it doesn't only provide you values for what you think some community mean physiological trait might be, but because all of the different species within a plot are cataloged, you can also get different physiological strategy of co-located species. So you can quantify the most vulnerable and the most drought-resistant species that are co-located in the same area to capture the full range of diversity in these physiological responses. Okay, in terms of the experiments that Greg performed, he specifically wanted to look at how stress might change between historical, which we defined as years 1995 to 2014, and future climates out near 2100. In this case, we were using the shared socioeconomic pathway 370, which represents kind of a moderate to moderately high emissions scenario. And Greg ran a number of different experiments planned or parameterized with the full range of trait diversity derived from the forest inventory. So we could really see basically the outcome of the full range of diversity of species co-located at any particular location across the continental US. Then Greg ran a separate set of experiments where he allowed this leaf allocation to be optimized to maximize integrated carbon gain. So we could not only ask this question about how species turnover would affect stress levels, but also how within species changes in allocation would affect plant stress levels. And then Greg quantified the extent to which shifts in traits and changes in allocation could be used as levers to roll back stress levels out near 2100 to those that are being experienced during historical periods between 1995 and 2014 as a metric for trying to quantify when we would expect to see biogeographic shifts. Okay. So here are the main results. I'm going to walk you through this figure piece by piece because I find it to be a little bit complicated. The color legend here indicates our different metrics of species diversity, where pink values here indicate that all trees within a particular grid cell could cope with this future climate stress out near 2100. Gray indicates that no trees within the forest inventory documentation could cope with future climate stress. This pie chart indicates the fraction of grid cells in each category. And anything in this red box indicates that you need at least some shift in species composition to roll back to historical stress levels under the projected future climate for that particular location. And the good news is we don't see all gray, but in most cases, most forest ecosystems will need at least some shift in composition to keep up with projected future levels of hydraulic stress. And if we actually layer on this additional process of acclimation in leaf area, can see that particularly in the Midwest and Northeast, that change in leaf allocation can really ameliorate some of the expected future climate stress, but you still have a number of different locations where a shift in species composition would be required to roll back to historical levels of climate stress. And what's actually really cool with this is we have our model predictions for if we're seeing this change over time especially when they were expecting climates out near 2100. How might our forest ecosystems need to shift to adapt to this change in climate? But there's also roughly 20 years at the time of this study of systematic forest inventory data across the continental US, where the Western United States is remeasured at 10-year intervals, and the Eastern United States is remeasured at 5-year intervals. So we can actually quantify the change we're seeing in the forest inventory and link it to different types of physiological strategies such as drought hardiness. And that's actually what Greg did, was he calculated the P50 velocity, or the megapascal changes per year in forest composition, documented in the forest inventory, and compared it to what the model predicted was required if we're anticipating these climates out near 2100. And so here, negative values correspond to shifts towards more drought-hardy forest compositions. The observations documented in the forest inventory are shown in gray right here. And these values actually are negative, so we were seeing shifts in composition towards more drought-hardy forests or drought-hardy species. But they were nowhere near as large as what the model predicted was required, especially if we're anticipating future levels of climate change out near 2100 under some emission scenario similar to SSP 370. So just to summarize, and the work I showed in this vignette is kind of collective work from Dr. Gregory Queaton, Dr. Justin Mathias, and Angie Wu, who was an undergrad in my lab. Observations show shifts in allocation across both space and time with water availability at different biological scales of organization, so organism to ecosystem. Process-based plant hydraulics models can explain this variability where water is a limiting resource. Observed trait diversity is sufficient to protect ecosystems against increasing climate risk in some locations, but species composition is not shifting fast enough to keep up with anticipated future climate stress. So with that, I'm going to transition to this next topic about when and where does physiological variation matter for capturing the biogeochemical consequences of ecosystem drought response. And this actually, there are a number of really interesting ecological studies showing some sort of effect of ecosystem diversity on stability to different types of disturbance events. The one I'm going to highlight is this study led by Dr. Bill Endreg at University of Utah, where he used a number of different eddy covariance towers, and he calculated the drought sensitivity of the forests near those eddy covariance towers as the decrease in either evapotranspiration or gross primary productivity during dry down periods relative to normal climate periods. And that's what's shown on the y-axis here, where increasing sensitivity increases along the y-axis. And then we actually also cataloged the variation in hydraulic traits in those flux tower footprints based on the known species there, where diversity here is increasing along the x-axis. And we found a clear negative relationship. So as diversity increased, drought sensitivity, or this anomaly in gross primary productivity or evapotranspiration, decreased. And so this is a really intriguing result. But if we're thinking about, at least from a global modeling perspective, some key follow-up questions that would be very useful are understanding what aspects of functional diversity are important for regulating global biogeochemical cycles. And then also, how does this vary geographically with climate? And in the first vignette, we talked about how different types of limiting resources govern ecosystem processes in different locations. This is actually true in this case as well. You would expect different types of resources or different types of diversity to be important depending on a particular location. And so this is work headed by a graduate student in my lab, Evan Margiota, And the tool that he used to try and approach this question is this really nice parameter perturbation experiment run by the community land model community. And this is the major land surface model in NCAR's CESM or system model. And in this parameter perturbation experiment where the land model was run offline, there were 500 ensemble members and 32 different plant physiological traits were perturbed using a Latin hypercube sampling framework. But what was really useful for Evan's purposes is that this perturbation kept the same trait means for each grid cell, but traits were perturbed in opposite directions for plant functional types that were co-located within the same grid cell. So you had varying ranges of trait diversity with the same trait means. You could separate out this diversity versus trait mean effect using these parameter perturbation experiments. And then Evan calculated drought sensitivity as well as some other sensitivity metrics in a very similar way to the Andrade et al. Study, where he looked at the gross primary productivity anomaly during the 3 droughtiest years of a 20-year simulation period, and he calculated the deviation of that from the climatological average over that 20-year simulation. Okay. So I'm going to go through a few key results, and this is our question of how traits vary across space with limiting resource. The punchline is that the types of trait that controls drought sensitivity does vary geographically. In this figure in particular, pink traits indicate that the drought sensitivity is most sensitive to carbon economy traits. Blue values indicate that that plant hydraulic traits are particularly key in explaining variations in drought sensitivity across these different ensemble members. And then yellower values here correspond to stomatal traits as being key in regulating this variation in drought sensitivity. And so a lot of this map to me looks kind of pink or orange, which in part has to do with the drought sensitivity metric we selected, which is the gross primary productivity and the sensitivity of gross primary productivity to drought events. But there's some notable locations where plant hydraulic traits are particularly important, as well as stomatal traits, and these are locations in the moist tropics in particular. Okay, so we talked about the geography of types of traits, but we're also really interested in the effect of trait diversity on drought sensitivity. And Evan actually found that it varies both with climate and also the number of plant functional types, which is somewhat an artifact of how we parameterized these ensemble experiments in the first place. And so brown values on this map correspond to trait means as being particularly important for drought sensitivity. Green values indicate that the trait diversity is particularly important for drought sensitivity. And then there's also a number of global traits that don't vary depending on plant functional type in CLM. And so grayer values correspond with these global traits as being particularly important. And so the moist tropics in this case jump out as trait means being particularly important. And as an ecologist, I think of the tropics as being a biodiversity hotspot, but in land surface models, there's really generally only one plant functional type represented in the moist tropics, and this is a broadleaf evergreen tree. And so there's really not the opportunity for trait diversity to be important in these locations. But if we look at like extratropical locations, we see this trait diversity signature as being particularly important for regulating some of these biogeochemical fluxes. And I think this is actually useful not only for thinking from an ecological perspective about how diversity might mediate drought sensitivity, but also when we're thinking about how to parameterize functional diversity in a parsimonious land surface model, and what sorts of axes of diversity we need to represent to accurately capture what the land surface is doing from a model whose primary tool is to think about carbon, water, and energy fluxes. And what's actually also particularly interesting is that Evan looked at both this drought sensitivity as defined by decreases in gross primary productivity during drought events, but he also used different metrics such as a hydraulic stress metric, which is one of the outputs by CLM. And hydraulic traits were much more influential globally in explaining variations in hydraulic stress. And I think this also maybe hints at some opportunities for future model development and making sure some of the stress consequences are propagating more into changes in plant carbon assimilation and feeding back on the carbon cycle, not only through potential impacts on turnover, but changes in carbon assimilation. So just to summarize, Evan found that both biogeographic variations in traits and local trait diversity are important for regulating ecosystem states and fluxes during drought events. In addition to increased ecological understanding, model predicted trait diversity effects and variations geographically provide an opportunity to think about how to better represent biodiversity in a parsimonious land surface model. Okay, so moving on to the final vignette today, to what extent do disturbance and climate stress introduce uncertainty in terrestrial carbon cycle predictions? So I've talked about throughout this talk different mechanisms underlying terrestrial carbon cycle uncertainty in a changing climate, and this includes the impacts of CO2 fertilization on the plant physiology, as well as the radiative effects. How higher vapor pressure deficits will influence tree stress and mortality, how biogeographic shifts might mediate land carbon sequestration. But one major or several major wrenches related to disturbance can really drastically change the magnitude and sign of the terrestrial carbon sink. And these include processes like wildfire and, excuse me, sorry, I'm still recovering from a cold. Yes, these include processes like wildfire and mountain pine beetle outbreaks. And this is actually a picture from where I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And these ponderosa pine forests have really been hammered by wildfire, drought, and mountain pine beetles. And so in this study, a former postdoc, Chao Wu, who's now an assistant professor at Tsinghua University, used 3 different types of modeling tools with different strengths and weaknesses to basically bound the uncertainty of how these wildfire and pest and pathogen outbreaks might be throwing wrenches in our carbon cycle predictions for the continental US. And one tool he used was a process-based land surface model output from 22 of the Earth system models participating in the coupled model intercomparison project, phase 6. And some of the strengths of these modeling tools include that they include the physiological effect of CO2 fertilization on plant carbon assimilation and its mechanistic underpinnings. So they're potentially really useful in out-of-sample conditions with elevated CO2 and climate. But some of their weaknesses include that the disturbance and mortality processes are less developed compared to carbon assimilation processes, or completely absent depending on which model you're looking at. The second model that Chao used was a semi-mechanistic demographic model that was built using the US forest inventory and growth curves derived from observations in the forest inventory, as well as disturbance. And one real strength of this model is careful consideration was paid to climate-sensitive disturbances like wildfire, insect outbreak, as well as drought mortality. And so this figure here shows an example of model validation and predictions for burned area using this model tool under different emissions scenarios. And you can see kind of this pretty wide divergence in burned area depending on the emissions scenario out near 20, and apologies for the lack of the x-axis, out near 2050. But one weakness is that it's empirical and it doesn't have this CO2 fertilization effect, so we're not going to get this positive feedback of CO2 on the plant physiology. And then the third type of model that we used is a random forest-based species niche model built using forest inventory and 8 seasonal temperature and precipitation variables. And one of the strengths is that there's careful consideration of species-climate relationships and their link to above-ground biomass. And so actually, if you go out into different types of forest ecosystems, the carbon storage and sequestration potential can really vary widely depending on species. And so this model does include that sort of process level understanding. But the weaknesses include that it's empirical and it doesn't have a CO2 fertilization effect, similar to this demographic model. So we have a model with the mechanistic underpinnings of CO2 on physiology, one that's thinking much more carefully about disturbance, and one that's really focused on biogeographic shifts and that influence on carbon sequestration potential. And so the experiments Chow did were pretty similar to the ones that we structured in Dr. Gregory Queaton's component of this talk, where we had this historical 20-year period between 1995 to 2014, and then looked at future climate out near 2100, in this case in a slightly more moderate emission scenario, SSP 245. And then we compared carbon storage changes across models and attributed these changes to disturbances and projected biogeographic shifts. Okay, so here are some key results. And just to walk you through piece by piece before we get into the different modeling tools, bluer values here correspond to increases in above ground live carbon, or AGCL, out near 2100 relative to the historical period. Redder values indicate carbon losses. And then the total value in the left-hand corner next to each panel represents the integrated change across the continental US, but any particular location could lose carbon or gain carbon, and that would be indicated by the color value on the map. And so you can see with this first panel, which represents the multi-model median across the 22 coupled climate Earth system models, there's really pretty widespread biomass gain or above ground live carbon gain. More so in the eastern United States and the West, but we do see blue basically everywhere. And this is due to the CO2 fertilization effect predominantly on plant carbon assimilation. If we compare that to our next modeling tool, the growth mortality or demographic model, that is really thinking a lot more about disturbance impacts on carbon, you can see that there's a much different pattern that squares a little more intuitively with my understanding of how ecosystems are changing based on a number of recent wildfire events, where you get this carbon loss throughout much of the western United States, and we'll talk about the why in just a slide or two, and some potential carbon gains across the eastern United States. And then if we compare this finally with the climate niche model, which is thinking about biogeographic shifts, you can see even a different spatial pattern and actually overall integrated carbon loss if we're considering across the entire continental US. And just quantifying the uncertainty injected using these different approaches, we took the average directional change, and here Chow hashed locations where all of the different modeling tools agree, and you can see there's a relatively limited geographic area where all of the different tools agree, even on the sign of the change in above ground live carbon. And because these tools, we can turn on and off processes, we can pretty clearly diagnose what's driving these changes. And so this is the overall pattern for the growth mortality or demographic model. And if we run the model with no disturbance, you can see a very similar pattern to what we saw in the Earth system models and about the same projected increase in above ground live carbon. If we layer on mortality associated with climate stress, and so this is drought and insect keys in the forest inventory, you can see that that does do quite a bit to moderate carbon gain, particularly in the interior western United States. But really, it's climate stress combined with fire mortality that is driving these losses across the western United States. And then we can also look into which species changes in the climate niche model are really driving these carbon loss patterns. And in particular, Douglas fir changes in California mixed conifer, shifts in aspen birch extent, and that pattern in the central eastern United States is shifts in the maple beech and birch forest type are really what is driving kind of those biomass losses in the overall continental map of the United States. But actually, if you look at all of the different 24 forest types that are documented in the forest inventory, at least if you believe these climate niche model projections, almost all of these forest types are losing spatial extent in some location or another due to these strong shifts in climate related to temperature and precipitation. And so finally, one area of interest that's been gaining a lot of steam over the past several years is thinking about using forests as nature-based climate solutions to help us get to our net zero goals. And there are a number of different carbon offset projects across the continental US that rely on some basically 100-year permanence of these forest systems to maintain their carbon sequestration potential. And we wanted to see how risky of a bet these different offset projects were. And so each of these offset projects is shown overlain on our three different model tool projections on this left-hand column over here, where we have the Earth system modeling tool on top, the growth mortality model that's thinking about disturbance in the middle, and the climate niche model, which is thinking about biogeographic shifts on the bottom. And all of the points are the same across all of the maps, but the coloring is a little different depending on the underlying map projections. So green values indicate that this carbon offset project was potentially going to show a carbon gain over the upcoming century, according to that tool. And gray values indicate that this carbon offset project would likely suffer a carbon loss according to the particular tool we're thinking about over the upcoming century. And so we thought about this both in terms of the number count of carbon offset projects and then the total spatial area. And for the Earth system models, in most cases, it looked like all of these offset projects were a nice bet and would experience some sort of level of carbon gain over the upcoming century. But if you look at the models that are thinking more carefully about disturbance or biogeographic shifts, a larger number of those projects moved into pools where we might expect carbon losses, which would really be detrimental given that we're banking on some sort of 100-year permanence for them to help us offset emissions. I think in like an applications-driven context, quantifying uncertainty can be somewhat discouraging because it's hard to come up with a consistent message for what should be done if there's a clearly large range of uncertainty, which disturbance does inject in our terrestrial carbon cycle predictions. But I think it can also be useful for thinking about how to strategically deploy science and resources across space. And so you might imagine locations where there's a large biomass change but low uncertainty, really useful from a scientific perspective for thinking about hypothesis testing about mechanisms underlying global change, for example. If we're thinking about possible nature-based climate solution project deployment, you might want to consider locations where there's consensus about a pretty small biomass change and high biomass overall from a forest carbon storage perspective. And then if we're thinking about locations that would be fruitful for new technique development, that might be locations where there's high uncertainty and low biomass, that we might be able to really hone some of the future remote sensing technology. So just to summarize, Chow showed that there are major uncertainties in future of terrestrial carbon cycle associated with CO2 fertilization, disturbance, and changes in species distribution. Characterizing these uncertainties can help with both advancing science and preserving the terrestrial carbon sink. And rather than an overall conclusion, I thought I'd highlight some really cool applications-driven research going on in my lab, thinking about kind of what's next. And so I've been working a lot collaboratively with Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park and Dr. Leander Andrag, as well as a wonderful team of students and postdocs and project scientists in my lab, really thinking about mature sequoia and resilience after some of these devastating wildfires that have happened over the past 5 years that have really driven a lot of mature sequoia mortality, even when these sequoia trees are traditionally thought to be pretty fire resilient. And so as I mentioned, we're thinking about it as both a mature tree prognosis and then post-fire recruitment of some of these tree seedlings after this disturbance event. And Dr. Kelly Kerr actually did this really cool study where she went out and measured the temperature occurring in major canopy gaps post-fire to characterize basically the harsh microclimate, because these seedlings are exposed to really elevated temperatures, drier soils, lower relative humidity. And she designed a growth chamber experiment basically to look at 3 key players in this ecosystem: incense cedar, which is shown as Cade on the top here, ponderosa pine in the middle, shown as Pippo, and sedgy or sequoia, shown in the bottom panel. And she wanted to really see, in these harsh environments, are these trees bumping up against their thermal safety margins, after which you get basically photosystem 2 degradation in these plant leaves. And she used these chambers to run some field-informed experiments where she had basically a heat and a drought treatment where she exposed these seedlings, and that's what's shown in red here. And what's actually really interesting is that the absolute thermotolerance threshold of all 3 of these species was quite similar. This is about a term or a trait known to physiologists as T-crit. And this is the critical temperature at which photosystem 2 starts to degrade, and this is an integral component of plant photosynthesis. But what was really interesting is that when you actually looked at the thermal safety margin, which is the temperature of the leaf, relative to this T-crit value, the sequoia, if you look at the bottom panel, especially when you're actually measuring the leaf temperature and not just using air temperature as a proxy, was already exceeding its thermal safety margins due to biophysical feedbacks, which is basically as it gets dry, plants close their stomates. This actually ends up causing a feedback where it further elevates leaf temperature. And these sequoias were much more prone to closing their stomates and overheating. And this was really squaring with what the boots on the ground perspective was from the park staff, that these sequoia seedlings were really not thriving in the higher severity burn patches that were very exposed. And this ties in really nicely to the motivation I provided at the beginning about this physiological effect of CO2 that's generally thought to be like exclusively a bonus from a like plant ecologist perspective, where higher CO2 can increase photosynthesis. It also increases water saving, so win, win, win. But if you're decreasing transpiration or your latent heat flux, you can also lead to leaf overheating and bumping into some temperature threshold, especially if we're thinking about under a higher CO2 atmosphere. And then just before I dive into any questions, I am hiring a postdoc right now. I should have updated the slide. The job ad is posted already, so if you should feel free to contact me, but this postdoc position is focused on mechanisms of forest resilience to wildfire in the Western United States. And if you might be interested, I'd be happy to direct you to where the job posting is. But with that, I'm done, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Anna. So everyone, you are free to raise your hand to ask a question, or just let me know in the chat and I'll ask them in the order that they are asked to me. We do have a couple of chat questions, so I'm going to go ahead and start with that. Are there studies on how intentional placement of litter mulch reduces evaporation on unshaded soil in drylands? Cover would likely need to be secured against wind, etc. Effectiveness in building soil moisture may require placement in advance of expected seasonal rain.
Yeah, so that is a great question, and I'm not specifically sure of studies focused on dryland, but there is a clear noticeable effect on how some sort of litter layer cover can increase water retention. And I think in some cases where there is like proactive planting from a management perspective, they might combine that with mulching as a technique from like a management perspective. I think in just some cases it can be like the labor and material applications might govern whether that's implemented in one location or another as like a strategy for replanting. But that's a great question.
Here's another one. So with predicted increases in heat wave intensity and duration, do the models consider that at some level and duration of heat exposure, you may impact P50 enough to start degrading or even killing off some species or key species? I could imagine this might vary by climate region and species.
Yeah, so that is a great question. And so I think so you basically in the modeling tool that I talked about, some of it has to do with like what is the time step you're running your model at, and then if it's some sort of dynamic vegetation model. And so oftentimes land surface models are run at a like sub-daily time step. The tool that Greg was using in the first chapters run at a daily time step, but you do get like documented changes in conductivity in response to different climate variables. And a number of the process-based modeling tools do have like lethal levels of stress that you might have. And so if that plant functional type dies, then you would get kind of a shift biogeographically in like the species composition related to as it relates to like P50 or drought hardiness, for example, and then that could feed back to like future ecosystem behavior.
Thank you. And then this is the last question that I have in the chat. So everyone, please raise your hand from now on. Oh, it's already 3. You
I
had
can
a
stay
time
for a few more
constraint.
minutes. I can
Okay,
stay.
sorry. I lost track of time a little bit just in the last couple minutes. Curious how wildfire occurrences in the future was applied to the model simulation along with the climate change stress. And then Mark added to that, how are wildfire intensities and extensivity predicted for the future?
Yeah, so in that model, basically part of the model development process was building wildfire area climate relationship and wildfire severity climate relationships. And so the wildfires projected into the future based on climate. And then in some modeling tools, it can also be based on fuel abundance, but it's like the climate relationship and the underlying climate forcing that's driving those changes in extent.
Okay, thank you. Do we want to try for one more question, or do you need to? Anna has to head to another
One more
meeting.
question is fine as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Does anyone have a last question while we still have Anna here? Here's a question. How did the studies take into account fluctuations within the growing seasons? Here in the Northeast, we had a very rainy spring, early summer, and then a drought late summer, early autumn. Tree stress was visibly evident. Don't know how this will impact this spring's growth.
Yeah, and so part of it might depend on like how the disturbance process is represented in the model and like what sort of time step disturbances run at. If it's like an annual time step, then it might do some sort of like water year integrated metric to basically assess flammability, and it might not necessarily capture that sort of dipole effect you're thinking about in terms of wet spring, dry fall. But in other cases, if you have like sort of a monthly time step and you're calculating like the dryness of downed woody fuels and the climate, then you would maybe capture that like pretty strong difference in risk, especially if your wet spring allowed for like a bunch of biomass growth and then that used up all of the water early and provided a bunch of extra dry fuels in the fall. So yeah, it would depend on your tool, but you may or may not capture that process you're interested in based on your observations of the climate right now.
Okay, thank you. We are a couple minutes past, so I think we're going to go ahead and conclude for the day. Thank you everyone for being here, but big thank you to Anna for giving us this talk. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, everyone. It was very nice. I appreciate you taking an hour of your time today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, absolutely. And our seminar series will continue next week. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye.